Yo, what's going on, y'all? It's Cone back here again today with another video, and today I want to talk for a bit about the Golden State Warriors. They've been a staple of the NBA's title contention picture for almost a decade at this point. They won their first title in 2015, made every single finals from then until 2019, and then struggled for a bit. They dealt with multiple big season-ending injuries to Klay Thompson, a year off pretty much entirely from Steph Curry, some Draymond Green injuries, and a 2021 year where due to some of those big injuries and just a lackluster supporting cast, even though Steph played some of the best ball of his career, the Warriors were unable to make the playoffs. They really struggled for a couple seasons, and it seemed like, hey, the dynasty might be over. But, as you already know, they bounced back in 2022, and behind the play of Steph, Klay, Draymond, new All-Star Andrew Wiggins, great role player play from like Jordan Poole and Kevon Looney, Gary Payton II, the Dubs were again NBA champions. So coming into 2023, they were a lot of people's pick to go ahead and repeat because at this point, if they had been healthy, they had been winning an NBA title or at the very least, making it to the finals themselves. They were a juggernaut that was seemingly unstoppable and was not slowing down just quite yet. But then 2023 was one of the weirdest years for this Warriors core, probably the strangest season out of all of them. It began, of course, with Draymond Green punching Jordan Poole in the face at a practice, which came out of seemingly nowhere. We didn't know about any tension between those two guys leading into the situation. It happened, and then all of a sudden, there's a weird air around this upcoming Warriors season. It felt like it probably wasn't that big of a deal because they had overcome some stuff in the past, but it did give it a weird start to begin with. And that was followed up by the team not playing very well out of the gate. They started incredibly slow for their usual standards, going 5-8 in their first 13 games, which put them at the 13th spot in the Western Conference. Now, the season was very young, so there wasn't time to panic, but it was a bit strange to see the Warriors not go off and dominate at the beginning of a season like they typically did. They really never had these slow starts. They'd, of course, eventually bounce back, making the playoffs as a 6 seed with a 44-38 record, despite a lasting injury to Steph and extended absence from Andrew Wiggins, and some other things here and there, but they never really felt like they regained their 2022 form the entire year. They never really felt like those true dominant contenders that we'd seen in the past, which felt strange. I made a video towards the end of the season where I said, I don't think this Warriors team is a team of championship contenders, and some people agreed with me, but a lot of people said I was crazy. I mean, we had seen the Warriors every year that they were healthy make it to the NBA Finals. Why was this year going to be any different? Sure, they had a worse record, they were a lower seed, but it was still the Golden State Warriors, and out of respect for what they had done consistently, I was like, okay, yeah, they probably are still championship contenders, but it never truly felt like that outside of their previous resume. Beyond their 6-seeded finish and their not great record, there were a number of things that made me kind of skeptical of this squad. And the first big one was the fact that they were completely unable to consistently find wins on the road. Throughout the season, they went 33-8 at Chase Center, which is a great mark. That was the second best record at home, only behind the Denver Nuggets on the season. But you take them away from that spot, and suddenly they just forget how to play basketball. Away from Chase Center, they were 11-30 on the season, which was the fourth worst mark in the entire league last season. By far the worst out of any of the playoff teams, and the only squads they were better than on the road were the Pistons, Spurs, and Rockets, who were legitimately the three worst teams in the league last season. I understand a team being worse on the road away from home, like that's very common in the NBA and sports in general, but this was something completely different, and we were seeing it from a very experienced core. This isn't like a young team trying to make a jump and they just can't seem to find their footing on the road. This was a core of guys who had won numerous championships together, and most of these players had been on the championship team the literal year before. They were being coached by Steve Kerr, who had coached all these championships. It was just really weird, and it gets even weirder when we take a look at some of the numbers that maybe caused this. Offensively, they were pretty consistent as a team. They finished 9th best at home and 11th best on the road, finishing in the top 10 offensively across the league, which is a pretty good spot to be. It was actually an improvement where they finished 16th offensively in 2022 when they won the title. But that's because their main calling card that year was their defense. They were one of the best defenses in the league, and it ramped up even further when the playoffs rolled around. This past season, that really wasn't the case. They were the 14th ranked defense this year, which isn't terrible. It's still above league average, but the home versus road splits is really where the problems start to show. They were the 4th best defense in the league at home this past season. They were stellar there. But as you probably guessed, you put them on the road, and they completely forget how to defend anybody. They were the 28th ranked road defense this season. That's horrible. That's only better than the Rockets and the Spurs. They were worse defensively on the road than the 17-win Detroit Pistons. I've talked to countless Warriors fans that I know. I've talked to a lot of people that just watch hoops like I do, and nobody really knows exactly why this was the case. Why when they got to the road, they did not know how to defend. They could not win basketball games. It was really weird, again, for a squad that is so experienced. Now, maybe one cause of this was the fact that Andrew Wiggins, who's a great defender, one of the best on the roster, missed a portion of the season, but even when he played, it was still an issue. And eventually their issues did catch up to them, and they lost in the West. They had not lost a non-finals playoff series since 2014 until this year, falling to the Lakers in the second round. So coming into this offseason, it was clear that something needed to change for the Warriors, but it was unclear what exactly their path would be. There were a lot of different routes that they could take to try and reshape this roster going into 2024. One big question was, what do you do with Jordan Poole? It seemed possible that he could be gone after his somewhat poor play this past season. I don't want to say he was bad because he wasn't, but he didn't live up to the expectations that a lot of people had for him after he got a big-time bag and was integral in them winning the finals in 2022. He was fantastic, and I felt like he was going to progress even further as a young player. Instead, he regressed a little bit, and he really did not live up to the contract that they gave him. Plus, there was the whole incident with Draymond Green, so it seemed like one or the other was probably going to end up going, and it seemed very unlikely they were going to let Draymond Green walk after he had been such an integral piece to so many title runs. So it did seem like Jordan Poole was probably on the way out, but it was probably more like a 50-50 whether he was going to be there or not. They also had young guys like Jonathan Kuminga and Moses Moody who were interesting, but could potentially be great trade chips. Plus, they had their first-round pick in the early 20s, and future first-round picks too. They haven't dealt a lot of their picks going down the line. It seemed like they were capable of putting together a decent package to get them a high-level player, or if they wanted to trade a couple chips individually, could orchestrate a couple of different deals to bolster the rotation overall. The Warriors had gotten a lot of slack over the past year for trying to do this two-timeline thing. I'm someone who's been a pretty vocal critic of what they're trying to do. They're attempting to win championships while also getting the next generation of Warriors ready to go to continue this dynasty on into the future, which theoretically does make sense. I mean, developing young talent is always something that you should try to do, and if you can do that while competing for a championship, why not go ahead and do that? But the problem is it feels like the Warriors have been sacrificing a little bit of their current ceiling to try and look forward towards the future. And right now, when you've got Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, Draymond Green, some of the greatest Warriors in franchise history, you've got a chance to capitalize on this now. I think you should be really willing to trade some of those young pieces for win-now veterans or just push chips down the line to say, hey, sure, we might have a couple of really bad years after these guys retire, but right now we're going to give ourselves the best chance possible to win titles. To me, that's the move you should make rather than trying to go full youth off the bench, something that they've been trying to do recently. So there are all these different routes the Warriors could go down. Do you trade Kuminga, Moody, go and try and add another all-star caliber player? Do you trade Jordan Poole? What happens with Draymond Green? Like, there were a lot of different ways this offseason could have gone, but ultimately the Warriors retained most of their guys and really only made one significant move, and that was the somewhat expected trading of Jordan Poole. But the guy they got in return was somebody that nobody would have guessed would be on the Golden State Warriors going to this upcoming season in Chris Paul, who the Suns had just dealt to the Wizards in exchange for Bradley Beal. It was a stunning and kind of hilarious move because if you didn't know, Warriors fans don't like Chris Paul. They had battles with him in the playoffs all throughout his time with the Rockets and, when he was on the Clippers as well. Warriors fans just don't like Chris Paul. But now he's on their favorite team and he's supposed to be a big-time contributor. And it's a move that drastically changes the Dubs' dynamics and the formula that they've tried to go with for years at this point. Like I said, outside of this, they didn't do too much else. They did re-sign Draymond Green to a 4-year, $100 million contract, which I think is a great decision. You can't let him walk at this point. They drafted Brandon Podziemski. They brought in Trace Jackson-Davis in the draft. I think he was a steal later on. They signed Corey Joseph, Dario Saric. They just added Usman Garuba on a 2-way contract. They're also reportedly interested in adding maybe a Dwight Howard or a Dwayne Dedmon as another veteran big there. Like, they made some solid additions, but I don't expect any of these new guys that I talked about to really contribute a lot for the Warriors this season. Maybe down the line, some of those younger guys that I talked about could, but this upcoming season, these guys might play spot roles here and there, but I don't think any of them are going to be these big-time contributors. And that all leads us to today. We're heading into the 2024 NBA season. The Warriors are weird. Like, this is the weirdest iteration of this Warriors squad by far yet. They've got young players. They've got their usual core. Gary Payton is back after being gone for half a season. Chris Paul is here now. It's super strange. But despite all that, I do expect them to be pretty good. It is still the Golden State Warriors, and I honestly think the moves that they made are probably going to make them a more consistent team. It, of course, begins with Steph Curry, who is still one of the best players in the world. I think at the very minimum, he's top 5, probably even top 3 in my opinion. He just had another monster season. It doesn't seem like he's slowing down at any time soon, and when he was healthy, he was dominant. He put up 29.4 points per game, 6.1 rebounds, and 6.3 assists, while shooting 49.3% from the field, 42.7% from 3. He was 0.7% away on this field goal percentage from a 50-40-90 season. He's not slowing down anytime soon. Steph still is and will continue to be one of the best players in the world, and as long as the Warriors have him, they're not only going to be a team in the playoffs, but they'll consistently be a terrifying foe on any given night, regardless of where you are in the standings. Meanwhile, Andrew Wiggins should hopefully be back for this full season. Like I said, he was gone for a little bit at the end of this past year with some personal circumstances. Hopefully, everything's okay there with him, and I'm expecting Wiggins to bounce back in a big way, although he doesn't need to necessarily because he put up nearly identical numbers to his All-Star season when he was in the lineup. He's still very impactful as a defender, as an energy guy, an overall X factor for this Warriors team. I think he's going to make a big impact this season if he's on the court consistently. Then we have Draymond Green, who is still one of the league's best defenders, period. I mean, as much as the Warriors struggled defensively this past season, it was not Draymond's fault. He is the reason they held together at all on some of those nights. He is a monster. Some advanced metrics say he slipped a little bit, but I think that's more so the team slipping as a whole without Wiggins in the lineup consistently, without Gary Payton II out there. Draymond is still one of the best defensive anchors and a Swiss Army knife on that end. Although the offense has completely fallen off a cliff and is somewhat non-existent, defensively Draymond is going to lock up regardless of who's in front of him, and he's going to be a big-time help for that team, helping them maintain and try and find some type of consistency this season. Wrapping up the core, there's Klay Thompson, who just averaged over 20 points per game while shooting 41.2% from deep on 10.6 attempts per game in his first full season back from injury. He still looked like the sniper that we know Klay to be. He actually knocked down the most outside looks in the entire league this past season. He was great. The shot selection is certainly questionable with Klay. It has been for most of his career, but when he hits them at that rate, you can't really question a lot of those shots. The defense isn't what it quite used to be either, when he used to be one of the best defenders at the 2-guard spot, but ultimately Klay did put together a solid season, and I expect him, as he continues to find his legs after, like I said, being off for like 2 full seasons, I think Klay is going to be better, or at least the same this upcoming year. Not to mention Kevon Looney, who's one of the best role-playing bigs in the entire association, especially again, not to mention Kevon Looney, who is so critical to this team's success. You take a look at the Kings series that they won in 7. There were multiple games in that series where I think you could have had all 5 Kings boxing him out, and he was still going to get like 4 offensive rebounds in 1 possession. Probably the biggest swing factor for this team, in my opinion, is the continued progression of guys like Jonathan Kuminga and Moses Moody, who are likely going to be again called upon to contribute for a team seeking a title. As I mentioned earlier, both have shown flashes at times of being high-level role players, and maybe someday they'll be stars, but it's just not consistent yet. It's not their fault. Like, they're both really young. A lot of players at this point wouldn't be called upon to contribute like this, but just by circumstance, they're on the Warriors, and they're looked at to do so. And this is where, in my opinion, Chris Paul comes in. The Warriors last year really struggled when the starting unit left the court. Amongst all 5-man units that played at least 200 minutes together this past season, the Dubs starting 5 of Steph, Klay, Wiggins, Draymond, and Looney had by far the best net rating with a plus 21.9 per 100 possessions. That's ridiculous. For reference, the second best 5-man lineup was the Cavs when they had Mitchell, Garland, Mobley, Allen, and LeVert out there, and they had a 15.1 net rating. That is 6.8 worse than the Dubs one. They were so much better than any other 5-man unit in the entire league. When those guys were out there, they were not just beating teams, they were crushing teams. But when the starters came off, the team immediately fell apart. They were terrible and really lost all sense of cohesion. They would regularly take out Steph or sub off a couple starters, and a 5-point lead would suddenly become a 10-point deficit. So it makes sense to try and fix this. The Warriors would bring in one of the league's best playmakers and floor generals in Chris Paul. Now, CP3 didn't have the greatest season this past year. He put up a career-low 13.9 points per game on his lowest field goal percentage since his rookie season. But he did shoot 37.5% from deep on a decent number of attempts and still averaged 8.9 assists per game, which ranked 4th in the league. Chris Paul can still knock down that outside shot, and he can still play make with the best of them. He's reached a point where he's probably no longer a high-level starting point guard, but if you have him as your secondary point guard, a playmaker alongside those second units coming off the bench, That could be huge for this Warriors team, especially for their young players who could really benefit from playing alongside someone like him in that second unit. He's shown multiple times throughout his recent career how he can really help young players find their footing, make life so much easier for them, and I could definitely see that happening again here. He can be a stabilizing force so that if Steph comes off, you've still got a great playmaker at the point guard spot who can set things up, who can keep the offense orchestrated, and can help guys find out their spots on defense. Individually, he's not a great defender anymore, but he still has that defensive IQ and those years of experience that I think could rub off on a lot of those players and build a lot more cohesion for this team that desperately needed it last season. Now, will Chris Paul single-handedly stop all their issues going from starters to bench and seeing that massive drop-off? No, I don't think he will, but I certainly think he can help quite a bit. Now, there is a rumor that he's going to start alongside Steph, Clay, Wiggins, and Draymond. I'll be honest, I don't love that idea. To me, a lot of times when they struggled defensively last year, it was because they lacked size. They've always been a smaller team out there, never really playing these big, lumbering 7-foot bigs like some other teams do. Kevon Looney is certainly a big, but he's, I think, 6'9", 6'10", so not really the size of a lot of those other bigs, and replacing him with a 6-foot Chris Paul in the starting lineup and moving Draymond over to the center, I just don't think it makes a lot of sense. To me, that could be a good closing lineup, or if you really want to get the offense flowing, I like that idea, but I just don't see it being a long-term solution as the starting lineup. However, it might be one of those cases where they just start him for the first few minutes, and then he comes out, Looney comes in, and they then stagger he and Steph Curry's minutes, just to kind of get a good start with those guys in the lineup together, get them ready for those closing situations. So maybe we see a little bit of that, but ultimately, I don't love the idea of Chris Paul starting. I think it's better. Just have him come straight off the bench with that second unit, orchestrate that offense, and again, if you get to the end of the game and you really want to put in a depth lineup of sorts, then maybe Chris Paul goes in alongside Steph in that backcourt. I will say, although I like the Chris Paul trade, I do have some concerns. Number one, he's pretty close to 40 years old at this point, and he's clearly regressed a lot defensively and offensively, so we could certainly see more regression this year, which could potentially negate a lot of the benefits that Chris Paul does bring to the table. If he continues to drop off a cliff, this could look like a disastrous trade, especially because they gave up Jordan Poole, who, although he struggled last year, was still really young and a big piece to them winning that 2022 title. If Chris Paul regresses a lot or just doesn't help the Warriors in the way that they're hoping he might, that might be looked back on as a massive mistake of a trade, giving up one of your best young players to try and prioritize winning now, even though that's probably what they should try to do at this point. To wrap up, let's go over some of my more general concerns for this team. The first one is I wish they would have added some more veteran talent in free agency or through some trades. I think Kuminga and Moody can take jumps in that Chris Paul is going to benefit them a lot, but if they don't reach the level they need them to, they don't have a lot of options outside of them. There's rumors that they could be adding like a Dwight Howard or a Dwayne Dedmon to bring in another veteran big, but I don't think either of those guys are going to be very impactful at this point in their careers, so maybe a trade has to happen at some point during the season to bring in more veteran help, but hopefully Kuminga and Moody just do progress. Still a question mark in my opinion. I'm also still concerned about the road thing from last year because that was just weird, as well as the defensive ups and downs that ultimately caused that issue. They didn't make the defense a lot better in this offseason. Maybe they're just counting on a full year of Andrew Wiggins, who's a great defender, Draymond Green being there alongside Gary Payton II, who, as I mentioned earlier, they traded for at the second half of the season this past year. So with those guys in the lineup and, maybe just overall more cohesion, I think they could definitely be better defensively. We saw their defense get a lot better in the playoffs this past year, despite facing a high-powered Kings offense in that first-round matchup. So maybe they'll be able to figure it out, and they've already shown that they can, but it is something that I'm still keeping an eye on. Finally, this is just an old team in general when it comes to their core players. Their main guys are all like 33, 34, 35. Chris Paul is nearly 40 years old. Regression could be coming soon for a lot of these key players. You've also got injuries that are probably going to keep ramping up with their ages. Steph has missed time recently. Chris Paul is definitely injury prone at this point. Clay has missed time. Draymond's missed time. If guys are in and out of the lineup or they need to rest players to maintain their play at this point in their careers, it's going to be hard for them to build any sense of cohesion. This is certainly a concern and something that we've seen pop up with a number of older teams in recent NBA history. Now, I'm not trying to say that this Warriors core is going to just suddenly drop off a cliff, but even slight regressions from one or two or even three of those guys could lead to the Warriors losing pace in what is a really stacked Western Conference. Overall, I think the Warriors are going to be pretty good this season and will likely be back in the title contention picture. I think the moves that they made make them a bit better in the moment. We'll just have to see if it's enough to rectify some of the issues from last season. For this reason, they're one of my most anticipated teams to watch this upcoming year. This is usually the case because it's the Warriors. They're always really good. They've got Steph Curry, one of the most entertaining players of all time. But this is different for them. Right now, they're in uncharted territory. Like I said, with this core, they had never lost a Western Conference playoff series. They had been in the lottery before. They dealt with significant injuries. But this is different. They're seeking redemption as they head towards the twilight of this group's time together with a new addition in Chris Paul, who himself is running out of time to get his first ring. It feels like we're heading towards the end of this dynasty, the end of this Warriors run, and this season may be one of their last big chances to go ahead and add another ring to their trophy case. We'll see if they can do it. I'm really excited to see what they do this upcoming season. Let me know what your thoughts are on the Warriors for the 2024 year down below in the comments. Would love to hear what you all have to say. Do you think they're title contenders? Where do they finish in the standings? Do you have concerns about them? How do you think Chris Paul is going to work? Because that's still super weird to me that he's part of the Golden State Warriors. And yeah, I appreciate y'all watching. Leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on future videos. And drop a comment down below for some other teams you want to see me break down before the season begins. I appreciate y'all watching. I'll see y'all later. Real one, stay back.